Hello and welcome into our guided notes here on the Renaissance. Hope this finds you well as we dive into part one, looking at the origins and the development of this time period in Europe. So again, when we're thinking about the Renaissance, again, this term Renaissance is a synonym for rebirth. Again, thinking of a time period of change, think about springtime and that rebirth that comes with the blooming of new flowers and whatnot. It existed before, but now it is coming back. There is a change taking place. Essentially, the medieval period in Europe was extremely taxing on the continent. You have issues related to famine and plague that spreads throughout Europe, and it's going to dramatically decrease the population during the Middle Ages. Now, despite lowering that population number, we do see a benefit later on, and that really comes from the fact that since there are less people living due to these large population decreasing events, the standard of living goes up because there is more plentiful stores of food. In addition to all this, we also see some changes kind of on bigger scales. Education becomes a priority in some locations where we see universities are opening up, as well as scholars from other parts of the world are fleeing to Italy. That really takes place due to the rise of the Ottoman Empire and their control over Constantinople, that many Byzantine scholars go to Italy in an effort to leave the Ottoman Empire. We also see that trade increases in Europe, but also in the Mediterranean basin at this point in time, which means that the economy is more robust. There's more money changing hands, and by the factor that the economy is moving, we're going to see that almost supercharges some of this rebirth that we talk about. So the Renaissance kicks off. And again, it's this return to the classical ideas and appreciations for art and architecture going all the way back to the Greeks and Romans. So why Italy? The rise of the Italian city-state is really important. The Italian city-states rebound first, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First, you can just look at the fact that there's a lot of coastal cities in Italy. Its location sticking out into the Mediterranean Sea meant that it was very easy for countries to, or these city-states rather, to be able to trade with each other and with other locations. These merchant classes that were living in these locations were able to kind of supercharge the rebirth, and they had the benefit that Italy, compared to other parts of Europe, had existing urban centers. Mainly because these were places that were cities during the Roman Empire, but had kind of fallen out of favor during the Middle Ages. They were able to be kind of rebuilt and revitalized during this time. We see places like Venice, which becomes a huge trading empire on the Adriatic coast. Up in the northeast of Italy, you have Rome, obviously, in central Italy. That becomes a very important location, not only for trade, but its importance as the center of the Catholic Church, and Florence as well. Florence and Pisa up in the north. Florence, though, being one of the few republican forms of government that existed, but is a very wealthy banking and merchant economy there as well. And a lot of that growth comes from the de' Medici family that is considered like the first family of Florence. So we know that it starts in Italy, and we know why it originates in these locations. But what are the values that we're returning to? We now have money, we now have an increase in trade and a better quality of life, but why are we going back, or what are we going back to? These classical and worldly values really change art, architecture, and a lot of how people interacted with the world. Secularism is this idea that we're less focused on religion. Instead of valuing religion, there's more of a value on life and the life in this world rather than focusing on salvation and some sort of afterlife. This means that we start to see people, because of this merchant wealth, really start to idolize belongings much more. We also see a rise in humanism, which again is celebrating accomplishments of man or just general human beings. The idea here again being that education and the human physique are important things, that we're not just concerned with divinity, we're considering the accomplishments of humans. We also see two other techniques or values that come up during this time. One is individualism, this idea that we're separating ourselves out from the crowd. So instead of you being one as a part of a larger society or a group, you are an individual. You have value as a singular person, and you also have agency to make your own choices and decisions. This is a big change from the world that most Middle Ages Europeans would have lived in. The other thing that we see is realism. There's a growing desire to depict the world as it looks, and not just these kind of lofty pictures of angels and saints, but we want to make sure that they actually are real people and they look, act in a way that is normal. And we see also a focus on normal people, not just monarchs or the clergy. So these values are seen in all sorts of artistic fields. We also see an increase in literature at this time, and there's lots of people that we can talk about. Castiglione is an author who writes the Book of the Courtier, and that was described basically, again, thinking of someone an example or an exemplar of an educated aristocrat, and what values and qualities should they have. Again, these were almost like manuals telling people how to behave or how to act. What was the ideal human aristocrat? Machiavelli also wrote the book called The Prince, and this again was kind of a handbook or a manual. Instead of focusing on the qualities of an aristocrat from a social standpoint, The Prince was much more focused on Italian city-states and focused on political power. He writes that people are essentially selfish and fickle individuals, and because of that, we're not concerned with what's morally right, we're more concerned with what's going to get us as humans ahead. And because of that, you need a ruler who basically does what is necessary in order to move the state, your city-state or later on a nation-state, forward. Right? And even if that comes into having to lie to the people, if it's for the good of the state, that is considered good. This idea of the end justifying the means. He also is very much focused on this idea of ruthlessness, where it is a good position as a ruler to be feared or revered, I guess, by your subjects than to be loved if you have to make the choice. Other writing takes place as well. We see Petrarch writes about and the joys of living, and we start to see this poetry come into play as well. The other big thing we see, Boccaccio writes books as well, but in addition to all of these authors, whether it's Cervantes with Don Quixote making fun of past eras, or writing these stories, again, presenting views of everyday life, we also see works, such as Thomas More, who writes about, again, society and this idea of like a utopia, this idea of like idealizing what humans could achieve. We also see Shakespeare, who takes literature and supercharges it. He writes plays on all sorts of dramatic emotions, love, greed, jealousy. And in that also invents a new vocabulary. What this all means is, again, we're seeing people that are focusing both on the substance of creating new things, but we're also seeing people trying to find beauty and present that beauty in certain ways. That society's not supposed to be just pragmatic. It's supposed to present information in an artistic way that makes you feel something. Okay? And this is what a lot of this writing shows. Next class, we will talk about art in the Renaissance in particular. So I hope you listen and watch part 2. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.